Just behind some of the security teams there, you see Nikki Haley standing, waiting to greet the president. There she is in the gray suit. The president, this is very significant. This is the first time as sitting president he will address the United Nations. His remarks today, along with Nikki Haley's remarks and the Secretary General's remarks on a panel concerning reforming the United Nations. The title of it, Reforming the UN Management, Security, and Development Meeting. That's today. And that is significant in its own right because this all comes from the America First president, who has been very critical of the United Nations, calling it unproductive, etc. You see the president there shaking hands, greeting the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, who has very, very much taken a front seat in all things diplomacy. Some say even trumping the spotlight of Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, especially in recent weeks. They are walking in. This begins at about 9:50 Eastern time, so in just about 20 minutes. We don't know what we will hear from the president. We have not received a plan or embargoed remarks from the White House on this one. But again, this is the America First president who has questioned the utility of the United Nations, who has said the United States gives far too much to the United Nations. So it will be fascinating to hear from him certainly today. Jim Sciutto is with us as well. Doesn't look like the president made remarks. We're going to try to listen in. But what are your thoughts as they head in together, Jim?
I think McMaster's comments yesterday, Nikki Haley's comments yesterday on the Sunday shows indicate there's going to be no softening of this America First message. I mean, clearly in some policy positions, there's been consideration. We talked about this a few minutes ago on climate change. Maybe if they could find a better deal, they might still stay engaged. But listen. They're talking about accountability of other states. They're talking about shared burdens, right? This goes back to the message in NATO that, yes, we will help make the world secure, but other countries have to do their part, right? This has been a frequent Trump message. So, you know, don't expect a warmer and fuzzier Donald Trump as he approaches the podium here. And I think, again, when I spoke to the White House last week, they're confident in that message, that this is Trump and this is what defined him and, in their view, helped elect him. And they're going to stay with that message.
The language, though, that he chose on the campaign trail, let's go back to March 2016. The United Nations is not a friend of democracy, is not a friend of freedom. Not likely words we will hear today.
No, you do expect for him to be the scripted Trump in this message, right? Not the Trump of Twitter. And we've seen that frequently when he is following prompter, reading the prepared remarks, that Donald Trump's message is more on message, right, as it were. Now, Donald Trump also is famous for his off the cuff improvisations that you'll often have at the podium. Will he do it here? I don't know. I mean, he's clearly been. There's been a lot of preparation to this. There's a lot of investment in time.
Of course.
There's a lot of physical presence here. I wonder if we can hear what he's saying there.
Yeah, we couldn't, and I believe you have General McMaster as well. Yeah. With the president. We'll see if he goes off those remarks.
But Trump, you know, for all of those very public, not just critical, but dismissive comments in years past, Donald Trump is showing up, right? And he's been here, and he's got a lot of bilats arranged, a lot of one-on-one meetings with world leaders. This is his hometown, right? As it were, this is New York.
And he's comfortable here, frankly.
He does. And keep in mind, he's showing up in the way that some other world leaders who have been less critical of the UN and more dependent on it. China's president's not here. Russia's president is not here. Angela Merkel is not here as well.
She's a big election coming up next week. She's staying at home. But those are three key meetings that he probably would have had, at least with some of those leaders, Xi Jinping for sure, and Angela Merkel if he were here.
And you might even say you might have wanted him to have face-to-face with a Putin on, for instance, the Iran deal or the many other issues that we have with Russia now.
Absolutely. Jim, stick with us. Jim's going to be with us throughout this special coverage. But also this story, if you saw the front page of the New York Times this morning, you undoubtedly read this. President Trump's legal team clashing over how much they should cooperate. Their own team. How much they should cooperate on the Russia investigation. This is the front page of the New York Times. The feud spilling over from the West Wing to a lunch conversation, one that was overheard by a Times reporter sitting at the table next to them, who snapped this photo of John Dowd, the president's personal lawyer, and Ty Cobb, another big-name D.C. attorney brought in to manage the response to the Russia probe. We are joined by that reporter who overheard the conversation and took the picture, Kenneth Vogel, Washington correspondent for the New York Times. Thank you for being here. A fascinating article. There's a lot to dive into here. So can you just set the scene for us? You're in this restaurant. They're speaking pretty loudly. You can hear them. And at some point you snap a photo. Do they have any idea who you are or how loud they're being?
I mean, I can't imagine that they would have had any idea who I was, nor how loud they were being, although they were having this conversation, not just in this restaurant, but in the sidewalk seating area of this restaurant where passersby, other diners, whomever, servers could hear them talking about this incredibly sensitive subject. I was actually there meeting a source for lunch. I had my lunch with the source. We noticed these two guys who we instantly recognized. Cobb is obviously very easy to recognize with that trademark bushy handlebar mustache. And so, you know, I'm talking to my source, and my source gets up to leave. And I say, you know what, I'm just going to hang out here for a little bit. And as I sat there by myself at this table taking notes on my iPhone, they proceeded to discuss some of the, you know, the most sensitive of this sensitive area in a way that was very easily audible to me and allowed for us to get at some of these issues that we kind of suspected were already in play with the legal team. That is this question over to what extent to try to assert privilege and to potentially withhold documents that might be privileged from the special counsel Robert Mueller. You kind of know that this is going on, but to hear them talk about it puts flesh on the bones, as we like to say in journalism.
Now you know. So let's dive into the most significant parts of the conversation you heard. There's a few. I mean, this was Ty Cobb complaining about Don McGahn and how much Don McGahn, in his argument, does not want to give up. I mean, there was one mention even that McGahn might be, quote, hiding documents in a safe.
Yeah, he said documents in a safe, where we weren't sure specifically what he was referring to there, but it was in this broader context about document production. Don McGahn, from all the folks who we've discussed this with, is of the mindset that he has a duty to protect not just Trump, but the office of the presidency. And so he feels that if he is green lighting document production that would potentially jeopardize Trump's ability, or the Trump White House's ability to assert privilege, it's not just going to affect this case and the Mueller investigation. It could potentially limit their ability to assert privilege in future cases, either if they come under investigation or there are other legal issues. And not only that, Poppy, but it could potentially influence or limit the ability of future presidents to assert privilege by setting a precedent that if a special counsel comes in and demands a bunch of documents from the president and the Oval Office and the executive office of the president ends up green lighting all this stuff, then it's going to make it that much harder for future presidents to say, no, you can't have this. This is privileged information.
Ken, there is a nugget in your reporting buried a little bit that just struck me like a ton of bricks this morning. Big picture, you report that there is so much uncertainty about all of this tied to the Russia investigation inside of the West Wing that White House officials are now so fearful in their conversations, even with colleagues, that they think some of their colleagues may be wearing a wire for Mueller's investigation.
Yeah, I mean, that shows the extent of the distrust. So there's the sort of abstract academic legal issue of privilege, which I shouldn't say is abstract. Clearly, in this case, it matters, and it's being manifested in their real life deliberations. But that the deliberations have become so fraught that there is suspicion that people about really which sides people are on. Now, some of this, you remember we had some of this earlier in the investigation where the Trump team brought in an outside lawyer by the name of Mark Kasowitz, and there was suspicion that he was leaking. There was subsequently a front page Wall Street Journal story that one of the lawyers on the team, we don't know precisely which one, may have advocated for Jared Kushner to step down because there was concern that the competing imperatives about defending the president, defending Kushner, some of these senior staffers, even Don McGahn has his own lawyer representing him in this case, because there is concern about the exposure that these different people might have. And they're not necessarily, while they're all in the defense, so to speak, they're not necessarily all on the same page. That's fomented quite a bit of distrust and suspicion, as we articulate in our story.
Ken, before you go, this is a restaurant a few blocks from the Times. It's in public, on the sidewalk, by the way, not even in a corner table in the back of the restaurant. These are two very highly compensated, highly trained, professional D.C. Power broker attorneys. What does this say about them?
I mean, it does. It's puzzling that they would be so indiscreet. And in fact, when we went to the White House and said, hey, we have this story and here are the sort of issues that we're curious about, here's how we know about them, and we let it be known, laid our cards on the table, we overheard this conversation. That precipitated a confrontation in which the White House Chief of Staff John Kelly and the White House counsel Don McGahn called out Ty Cobb and said, you can't treat this sensitive information so carelessly. So there's clearly concern about the way that this transpired.
And we're out of time, but people need to read your report if they haven't yet to get the color of your conversation with Ty Cobb afterwards, trying to sort of clean things up, and was effusive in his praise for Don McGahn after he realized that this conversation was heard. Ken Vogel, great reporting. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Poppy.
President Trump, minutes away from making his debut, you just saw him enter the United Nations with Nikki Haley. We are following his entire visit also. Without even being there, the president had a huge role in the Emmys last night, and he might get that.
The Wax RX Ear Wash.
Top of the hour, 9 a.m. Eastern. Good morning, everyone. I'm Poppy Harlow in New York. President Trump is about to kick off a week unlike any he has faced before at a place that he rarely fails to criticize. In just minutes, he will set out from Trump Tower for his first ever meeting at UN headquarters, a session fittingly on UN reforms. Now, tomorrow, he will make his debut address at the UN General Assembly, and the world is holding its breath, if you will, over what the America First president will say and how he'll say it. The president also set to meet one-on-one with more than a dozen fellow world leaders, not including Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, or Angela Merkel, all three of those leaders skipping this year's General Assembly. Our Jeff Zeleny is, of course, not skipping it. He is outside of the United Nations with a preview of what is ahead for the president. So the big to-do is the speech tomorrow. But today is significant, right? Because it's unclear if his message is going to change significantly from where it's been on the UN.
Good morning, Poppy. That's absolutely right. We've heard President Trump talk so much about the United Nations, been very critical of the United Nations, as some American politicians are. But today he will come here to the United Nations, bringing essentially his America First policy here for all the world to see and dissect. Now, we've seen the president travel a few times around the world, been on the world stage somewhat during his first 8 months in office. But today the world is coming here to his hometown. This week, of course, is a big one for the president, as all of the world leaders are looking to discern what is really in the Trump doctrine. Of course, the issues on the table here are UN reform, like you said, but North Korea and the rising nuclear threat certainly looming large in everyone's mind. The Iran nuclear agreement, also important. Climate change, of course, another point of conversation. But again, North Korea is something that is going to be front and center in conversations and in his speech tomorrow. His ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, talked about the threat of North Korea on CNN's State of the Union Sunday. Let's watch.
Was the president's fire and fury remark an empty threat?
It was not an empty threat. What we were doing was being responsible. Where North Korea is being irresponsible and reckless, we were being responsible by trying to use every diplomatic possibility that we could possibly do. We've pretty much exhausted all the things that we could do at the Security Council at this point. Now, I said yesterday, I'm perfectly happy kicking this over to General Mattis because he has plenty of military options.
So by saying kicking it over to General Mattis, of course, the Defense Secretary, General Mattis, they're talking about military options still on the table. But the reality here is, Poppy, that is a last worst case scenario. There are few people inside the government and indeed the White House who want to use military options. Yes, we heard President Trump last month talk about unleashing fire and fury, unlike the world has seen on North Korea. But the reality here is more people are hoping for a diplomatic solution. We'll see what he says in his speech tomorrow to the United Nations General Assembly, Poppy, but he will be arriving here shortly to talk about UN reform before launching a full day of meetings here in New York. Poppy.
Jeff, Nikki Haley calls it a new day at the UN with all these changes. We'll see if the president echoes that language. Thank you very much. Jeff Zeleny at the United Nations with me now in person. We are lucky enough. Jim Sciutto, CNN national security correspondent. We're usually talking through boxes, and you're here, of course, for the big week ahead. So, I mean, this is the America First president, and I think we got a bit of a preview yesterday from his national security advisor, H.R. McMaster, on what we may hear from him. Let's play that.
Well, he thinks the speech is a tremendous opportunity, obviously, to reach so many world leaders at the same time and to emphasize really three themes. First is to protect the American people. The second is to promote American prosperity. And the third is really to help promote accountability and sovereignty.
American, and sovereignty.
Yeah. Listen, sticking with, there was no softening of the America First line there from his national security advisor. You might even say a doubling down. I mean, fact is, on some of the most America First positions, there has, or at least been signals of softening with confusion. I mean, the whole thing about the climate change deal, are they going to back off leaving it? Possibly. Clearly, there's something going on there, something of a signal, but to admittedly very skeptical world leaders on that issue. If you look at NATO, I mean, his early comments on NATO were obsolete. He would not recognize the mutual defense treaties in his public comments in Europe. That said, there were private assurances made from other leaders.
And then he did.
And then he did. He did finally do that. So you have some softening of those America First positions. But the truth is, I speak to European diplomats frequently, and of course, there are things they'll say in public and things they'll say in private. But in private, there is genuine concern. Not just about the positions, but also about the style of leadership.
So looking back at some of the specific word choice that he's made over the course of months since the campaign on the United Nations, he's called it, quote, not a friend of democracy, not a friend of freedom. He's called the UN an underperformer and an institution that, quote, causes problems. I mean, when Dana pressed Nikki Haley on this yesterday, she said, look, a lot has changed. It's a new day at the United Nations. Is there any indication that the president will see it as anything like a new day at the United Nations, and also please his America First base?
The fact is, he already has seen it that way, right? Because the only U.S. And really Western world response to North Korea has been via the UN, via Security Council resolutions that the U.S. worked through Nikki Haley very hard for. I mean, this was a priority. They pushed Russia, they pushed China. They didn't get quite as far as they wanted to in terms of economic sanctions.
He called them not a very big deal.
Yeah, but the fact is, if you look at the policy, even with all the saber rattling of there were military options on the table, as Jeff Zeleny said there, here's the thing about military options, and this is not said in clear terms publicly, any U.S. military option has enormous human cost. For South Korea, Seoul is very close to that border. For U.S. citizens in South Korea, for U.S. troops in South Korea, and not in the hundreds, right, but risk in the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. So is that a cost that the American public is willing to bear and that the president is willing to take his country to? They have not articulated that case. So anytime you hear military options, and there are military options, remember, attached to them is enormous human cost. And that life, in a scale that we haven't seen since, I mean, frankly, you could say, well, Vietnam War or World War II.
I think Ken Burns' 18-hour documentary, The Vietnam War, kicked off last night. An important sort of perspective to give the American people in times like this. So stay with us, if you will, Jim. Let's bring back in our panel Jeff Zeleny, also joining us, Nia Malika Henderson, our senior political reporter, and Rear Admiral John Kirby, CNN military and diplomatic analyst. Nia, how do you see it? I mean, how will the president's remarks diverge from what Nikki Haley said yesterday?
You know, that's the thing. With this president, we never really know. And I think also with this president, typically you have major speeches and often they have a short shelf lives. And I think with this president in particular, because he can be obviously very presidential when he is scripted, sort of teleprompter Trump, but his asides will matter. I mean, does he kind of go off script here? Does he go off script in meetings that he has with leaders? He's got a bevy of meetings today with foreign leaders and throughout this week. And does he go off script on Twitter? I mean, that's what we have seen from this president, calling the leader of North Korea Rocket Man over this weekend on Twitter. You imagine he probably won't say that in his UN speech. But that's the thing. I think with this president, there are many versions of him. And a lot of that, I think, has sown a lot of confusion and a lot of need for back channeling among people like Tillerson, among people like Nikki Haley, who are often on cleanup duty going behind this president because of him going off script.
Right. McMaster forced to try to, define and defend the Rocket Man comment, talking about a man who wants to, who is provoking potential nuclear war yesterday on the Sunday shows. He had to try to explain the president, what the president meant by that. Admiral Kirby, to you, you are not optimistic heading into the president's remarks. So what would surprise you to the upside?
What would surprise me are three things, and I actually have no expectation of being surprised. One would be on Syria. I haven't heard this administration talk specifically at all about a political diplomatic solution to the crisis in Syria. They do a good job of talking about how they're going after ISIS, and frankly, we are going after ISIS in conjunction with the coalition. But you never hear anything about a diplomatic solution to the crisis in Syria and how we're going to move forward to create an atmosphere there where people don't have to leave and seek refuge and where terrorism doesn't take root. Number two, North Korea, we talked about that already this morning. Again, you hear a lot of saber rattling, fire and fury, kick it over to General Mattis. Well, I think he's now Secretary Mattis, and I think the last thing he wants to do is explore military options. I mean, obviously, he's got to have them ready. I don't hear anything specific about the diplomatic solutions that they're pursuing. They keep giving sort of lip service to, well, we're still pursuing diplomatic, but they don't talk about it in any kind of detail with any kind of fidelity. And lastly, and this one I really don't expect to hear, when, McMaster last week, when he went to the podium at the White House, he talked about how the president's speech is going to focus on sovereignty and accountability. And he mentioned that on Sunday as well. Sovereignty and accountability. Ideally, what he's talking about is protecting our sovereignty in America and holding others accountable. Well, I think we ought to flip that a little bit. I mean, we ought to be able to understand that sometimes protecting our security and prosperity is about protecting the sovereignty and the interests of other people elsewhere. And it also means holding ourselves accountable to a higher standard of governance, of anti-corruption work, of human rights. And I don't really think that when they say sovereignty and accountability, that they're going to be pointing the finger at them a little bit.
Jeff Zeleny, the president, is set to meet later today with Emmanuel Macron of France, who he has a much better relationship now, it seems, after his visit there than previously, and also Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel. The key in that Netanyahu meeting is clearly going to be Iran and what the U.S. decides, what he and his administration decides to do regarding the Iran nuclear agreement.
No question, Poppy. That is one of the issues front and center. If it wasn't for North Korea, I mean, that, without question, is the biggest challenge on the president's desk. But of course, Iran also front and center. And we do not hear the president talk about it very much. Of course, when he ran for president, he said he would rip up that agreement. Well, of course, that has not happened. One deadline after another has passed here. So what's interesting about this president, Poppy, we see and we're learning as he grows in office, we hear him say a lot on social media, on Twitter. We do not hear him talk much about specifics of Iran, specifics of really anything he'll do on the world stage or the Trump doctrine. So I think this week gives him that opportunity to fill in some of those blanks here. But the question here is, what will come of it at the end of the week? And I do not hear any particular conclusions. The White House is not telegraphing any of those. The reality here is sovereignty, as Ambassador Kirby was just saying, is America first. This is the America first agenda the president's going to bring here. We'll see how many specifics, if any, come with it.
Very quickly before we go, Jim, what are you listening for? We're going to hear from, it'll be Nikki Haley, Secretary General, then the president in about 30 minutes.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. I spoke with a senior White House official on Friday who said that one thing that they want to highlight at this UN General Assembly is that the president has better relationships with senior officials, world leaders like a Macron of France or even a Peña Nieto of Mexico than people realize, that personally they get along much better than the public knows. And that's something that they want to show here.
This is a chance for him to do that in those bilateral meetings with about a dozen world leaders. Thank you all very much. Stick around as we await the president and Nikki Haley speaking. A lot ahead for us. Hours before his debut at the United Nations, the president retweeted this, a pretty shocking video edited to show him hitting a golf ball, then knocking over Secretary Clinton. What will world leaders think? What should they think? And tell us how you really feel. A pair of President Trump's lawyers go out to lunch at a D.C. restaurant very close to the New York Times offices, and they speak really loudly, one of them slamming another attorney on their team. We're going to talk to the reporter who heard it all, and it must have made his jaw drop. And Sean Spicer hits the Emmy stage cracking jokes about crowd size, but essentially conceding that he misled the American people. Funny or too far?
Facebook says it has handed over Russia-linked ads and other records to special counsel Robert Mueller after his office obtained a search warrant for those things. Joining us now to talk about where the investigation is former federal prosecutor Renato Mariotti. He believes this is the most significant development in Mueller's Russia probe since the FBI raided Paul Manafort's home last month. Mr. Mariotti, thank you very much for being here. Tell us why this Facebook development is so big.
So up until now, what we saw was Mueller taking a look at fairly narrow areas. So he was looking at, for example, whether Paul Manafort and Michael Flynn had lied on disclosure forms. We knew that he had some sort of tax investigation because he had engaged the IRS criminal investigations unit. We knew he was looking at obstruction, which is actually a fairly contained thing, you know, whether or not Comey was fired for improper reasons. And now for the first time, Bob Mueller is investigating individuals from Russia. He's investigating whether foreigners made contributions illegally in a U.S. election. And so for the first time ever, we could see an indictment that has Russian people and Americans in the same charging document, the same indictment. That's, to me, that's pretty shocking and that's pretty big news.
And the fact that apparently a search warrant was involved is also something of significance, you believe.
For sure. So what that means is the fact that a search warrant was involved means that Bob Mueller had to gather evidence, put it in an affidavit written by a federal agent, and present it to a federal judge. So you literally had a neutral third party, a federal judge, who decided that there was good reason to believe that a crime had been committed and that evidence of that crime existed on Facebook. So it's not just, you know, well, Bob Mueller's looking at this or decided to take a look at it. It says he's already got evidence. He's closing in on foreign individuals who tried to undermine our elections, and he has enough evidence to convince a judge that he should get a search warrant.
But
it's
just
pretty
to be
significant.
clear, I mean, when you say that we could see foreign names and American names on the same charging document, you mean that people from Facebook could be charged with a crime for taking money for these ads?
I don't know. So let me explain that. I don't know who in the United States, if anyone, was involved in helping the Russians. You know, maybe no one, maybe they did it all on their own. But if you know about criminal activity and you help to make it succeed, you're guilty of aiding and abetting that crime. And so given that Bob Mueller already has evidence of a crime that occurred on and through the Facebook servers involving foreign nationals, it is not inconceivable that Americans could get caught up in that. And really, this is the first charge, or the first thing that he's looking at in this investigation that suggests that we could see that sort of charge coming out.
Because collusion, as you well know, is not a legal term, right? Collusion is a word we've been using for some months right now. But if there were Americans somehow involved with the Russians who you say, you know, may be breaking the law here, that connection would put them in legal jeopardy. One of the things that people have been asking, you know, Facebook, Russia used Facebook to place these ads. How did they determine the analytics? How did they determine where to run the ads? How to target them? Was that information provided by any American?
But you should join Mueller's team. I think those are very good questions, and I think those are questions that people on Mueller's team are going to be asking. You know, we have heard, like you just said, we've heard this term collusion thrown about. It doesn't really mean anything legally, but what I just talked about, aiding and abetting, that does. And same with conspiracy. Conspiracy is when you agree to commit a crime. You don't have to know about every aspect of the crime. You don't have to know everyone involved. But if somebody here in the United States agreed to be part of this in some way, they are criminally liable. And so, you know, the time will tell what Mueller finds. But as you point out, there's a lot of digital evidence that Mueller could look at, like, for example, the targeting information in terms of how to target these ads. He might be able to match that up with communications and show that Americans were helping Russians target those ads. Obviously, I don't know. I'm not part of Mueller's team, but for the first time, we could see a path to that happening.
Renato Mariotti, thank you very much for giving us your legal expertise here.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to do the good stuff next.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. All right, each day we move closer to the deadline for so-called dreamers to be deported unless Congress acts. Our next guest is one of the most outspoken immigration advocates in Congress. He has used very strong language to express his anger at the administration over their treatment of Dreamers. Joining us now is Democratic Congressman Luis Gutierrez. He is a member of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. Great to see you, Congressman.
Thanks for having me.
All right, let's go back in time to September 5th. That's when the president announced that Dreamers would have to go unless Congress figures out some sort of protection for them. You were so angry on that day that you lashed out at the chief of staff, John Kelly. Let me read what you said that day. General Kelly, when he was head of the Homeland Security, lied straight to the faces of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus about preventing the mass deportation of Dreamers. General Kelly is a hypocrite who is a disgrace to the uniform he used to wear. He has no honor and should be drummed out of the White House along with the white supremacists and those enabling the president's actions by just following orders. A lot's happened since then. Do you regret speaking that strongly and criticizing John Kelly?
Let me just say this. I could have been more careful with the use of my words. There are times that you need to reevaluate. Having said that, I saw him as head of Homeland Security deport grandmothers who had been for 15 years reporting dutifully to Homeland Security with their American citizen grandchildren. Heartless actions and increasing deportations against people who presented no threat. He said to me, not further than this distance, I'm the one that's stopping the Dreamers from getting deported when he was head of Homeland Security. I care about them. I'm defending them and protecting them. And then he goes and becomes head. And it was a pretty heartless thing to do. So yes, you can always be more careful. And I will probably be talking more about that in the future. And you can choose your words more carefully. But having said that, it really hurt. It was really painful.
But
I think that we need to set a standard for everybody to move forward on.
But instead of blaming President Trump, you blamed John Kelly because he had spoken directly to you. I mean, why lash out at John Kelly? And why bring his military service into it? I mean, since he's so celebrated for that.
Let me just say this. I didn't look at him in terms of his military. What I looked at is a politician, somebody who had gone to work for Donald Trump. I mean, I sat there and I thought, hundreds of Dreamers are serving in the armed forces of the United States, sacrificing their lives in defense of this nation. Thousands of members of our transgender community, many of whom have given up their lives in defense of our nation. Where was he? He wasn't speaking about those men and women in our military service and families that have become under attack. Attack why? And so I thought of 800,000 young people. I meet with them every day. It is a painful situation to watch what they go to. Again, can you use words more carefully? Certainly you can.
John Kelly responded to you after you said that about him. He then put out this statement. This was about a week later. As far as the congressman and other irresponsible members of Congress are concerned, they have the luxury of saying what they want as they do nothing and have almost no responsibility. They can call people liars, but it would be inappropriate for me to say the same thing back to them. As my blessed mother used to say, empty barrels make the most noise. Obviously, he was directing that at you, but we've advanced since then. Since all of this, between you and John Kelly, then President Trump had the meeting with Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi where it sounded like they hatched a deal to protect the Dreamers. Do you think that's going to happen? Are you heartened by what you've heard?
Here's what I think. I think that Donald Trump took an action against 800,000 of our youngest, most vulnerable people. And the American public should understand something about the 800. They've been through a security background check, not once, because they have to do it every 2 years. Many of them have done it 3 times. As they've submitted their fingerprints, they have absolutely no criminal background, and they're going to school, they're paying taxes. 91% of them are working. So I have school teachers, I have doctors, I have engineers, I have people at all facets. But most importantly, I have people who are moms, too, of children and their wives and husbands, and they shouldn't be used as political fodder by Donald Trump. When he kept saying, and you can find Donald Trump saying throughout, well, first I was going to get rid of them, but now they're good kids. I'm going to do, remember he used to say, I'm going to do something real special. Real special? You have 6 months. And if you read very clearly the statement by the White House on that, they said, you've got 6 months to get ready to leave.
But
the only country Most of them, no.
But is this going to happen? Is Congress and whatever Nancy Pelosi and Schumer have done, are they going to save these folks?
Great question. Here's what I think. As you watched and I watched, they passed the budget, the continuing resolution. They lifted the debt ceiling, and we did the hurricane relief. 90 Republicans walked away. That means today their operating majority is 152. They cannot pass a budget. They cannot increase the debt ceiling. They can't do anything moving forward. And as we all know, that budget and debt ceiling vote was 90 days. Yeah. So that means sometime before Christmas, we're going to have to go back. And all I am saying is the following. I am not going to go back. And I am encouraging Republicans, and I will suggest to you, a majority of members of the House in the Democratic caucus clearly will not vote for a CR, will not vote to increase the debt ceiling unless something happens, which is 800,000 visas for those
Unless you
dreamers.
protect the dreamers, you're not going to vote on a continuing resolution.
Why? Look, they're in the majority. It's their budget. They run the White House. They run the Senate. They run the House. You want to have a budget? Do your budget. You don't want to protect dreamers? Then do your own budget. Look, part of the Democrats' responsibility is to be an opposition and to take when they attack our LGBT community, to stand up for them, or when they attack women and reproductive rights, and in this case, very vulnerable dreamers.
Okay, we'll see what happens over these next months. Congressman, thank you very much for coming in to share your thoughts on this. John.
All right, Allison, thanks so much. Dozens arrested overnight in St. Louis as protesters react to the acquittal of a police officer in the shooting death of a black suspect. We'll have the details next.
Let's run this by BDO.
Donald Trump will make his debut at the United Nations this morning with a big address to world leaders tomorrow. What will the president say? Here to discuss, someone who has been there, former British Prime Minister Tony Blair. Mr. Prime Minister, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
So President Trump's been to Europe. He has spoken to European leaders, addressed the world before a few times, but this is his first time at the United Nations. His previous speeches, he was sort of greeted with side-eye, curiosity, maybe some scorn in some places. What does the president need to say this week?
I think it's quite an important moment because this is the first time the world as a whole will be looking at the American president, hearing him. And I think there needs to be clarity, consistency in the American approach. And, you know, people want always the same thing from America and from its president. They want to know that America's strong enough to stand with its allies and to stand up to its enemies. And therefore, I think what people will be looking for today, tomorrow when the president speaks, is an idea of what are the principles that are going to guide American policy, and is there clarity and consistency around those?
Are there those things right now? Is that lacking?
I think there's a mixture of sort of curiosity and anxiety, but this is not totally unnatural when you get a new president coming in. However, I do think this is a very important moment. There's so many challenging issues in the world today, not least obviously North Korea, but people in Europe will want to know, is this alliance still strong? People in the Middle East will want to know where America stands on the issues of the Middle East today. And I think if people get that clarity message, that will be great. But that's what they'll be looking for. They want to, you know, America's the most powerful country in the world. What everyone wants to know is, where does America stand and where do they stand in relation to them?
And of course, I mean, in terms of uncertainty, there's the latest terror attack in London. And sadly, it wasn't the first this year. I think there's been 5 terror attacks. We have a list of all of them. I don't need to remind you, of course, of some of them, but just horrible ones. I mean, obviously, van attacks, the bridge attacks, you know, also the Manchester Arena bombing at the concert. What's going on in London? Is there something, are there lessons to be learned here? Is something failing?
I think there's a lesson to be learned because it's happening all over Europe and indeed all over the world. You know, one of the things my institute does is actually track day by day terrorist incidents across the world. There's literally not a corner of the world, apart from perhaps South America, where this isn't a daily occurrence. So the question, I think, is the thing I would focus on is, obviously you take security measures to defeat those who are planning violence. But I think the deeper question is, how do you defeat the ideology of this radical Islamist, you know, idea?
What's the answer to that?
The answer is, I think, that you've got to weed out those elements that are promoting this, whether it's on the internet or those people who are giving messages to people, turning them into these types of people who are engaged in violent acts against our way of life. And I think this needs to be done on a far bigger scale than we have at the moment.
This is how President Trump first responded to the latest terror attack in London. He put out a statement on Twitter. He said, "Another attack in London by a loser terrorist. These are sick and demented people who are in the sights of Scotland Yard, must be proactive." This is how the current Prime Minister, Theresa May, responded to the president's statement. Listen to this.
I don't think it's helpful for anyone to speculate on what is an ongoing investigation. It is necessary for us to look, as we are doing, at whether our police and security services have the full capabilities, the powers that they need. Of course, we review after any incident that takes place, and we have had, sadly, a number of terrorist attacks in the UK.
So put yourself back in 10 Downing Street. Had you been Prime Minister at the time that President Trump put out that statement saying that these two people, these terrorists, were in the sight of Scotland Yard before apparently having the evidence in front of him, what would your reaction have been? How would you have felt?
Well, I think I agree with what the Prime Minister's just said. Look, in the end, by the way, the most important thing for us is not what anyone's tweeting about it, it's how we actually deal with it. And you should know that we are foiling plots the whole time. And so is, by the way, virtually every other European country. And this is why I say to you, you've got to deal with this at a security level, but then deeper down, you've got to be asking yourself, how is this ideology and the violence that comes with it getting transmitted, particularly to younger people, worldwide? And that's a whole other question with a whole other set of policies attached to it.
Well, look, President Trump thinks that the answer is a stricter, bigger travel ban. I mean, he believes, if you believe the rhetoric around his travel ban, that if you prevent people like this from coming into the United States, that we'll be safe here, and that there has to be a better way to prevent the people like the teenagers who just pulled this off in London from even coming into your country.
Yeah, but you see, part of the problem we've got in the UK and other places in Europe is often you've got homegrown people that are engaged in this.
Yeah, here too, by the way.
Yeah, so of course you've got questions to do with borders and security, and these are very important questions. But I really do believe the deeper question, I mean, right now, for example, around the world, you have millions of young people being educated in religious madrasas, in very strict terms, dedicated to an ideology that preaches hatred against those that are different. Now, if you've got that going on in the world, yes, of course, you've got to protect yourself by security methods, but in the end, you've got to be rooting out that type of education and that type of propaganda. And this is where, obviously, the internet's also very important. One of the things we work on in my institute is how you manage to stop these types of messages getting through to people. When they go onto these sites, you divert them onto sites that are more positive. But this requires, frankly, a revolution in approach way beyond anything we've done so far, because otherwise, I'm afraid this problem is going to grow.
And again, you talk about your institute, the Institute for Global Change. Do you feel like you're swimming, against the tide right now when nationalism seems to be the trend?
Well, I think it's important we rediscover the importance of international engagement. I mean, one of the things we're doing this week is looking at that whole group of countries across the northern part of sub-Saharan Africa. Poor countries, exploding populations, weak government, extremism rife. Unless we're supporting them now, they are going to be a source of future terrorism, of waves of migration that are going to destabilize our societies further. So, my view is we need a completely different, much more radical, much more far-sighted approach to dealing with this than we have at the moment.
And if people want to learn more, they can go to the Institute for Global Change and find out all the things that you're working on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Great to have you here,
It's a pleasure.
Mr. Blair. We're following a lot of news this morning, so let's get right to it.
Very important week for the president. The world will be listening.
If the United States has to defend itself in any way, North Korea will be destroyed.
This is probably one of the most serious national security crises we've faced.
President Trump calling North Korea's leader Rocket Man as he prepares to address world leaders for the first time.
He's a disruptor. He enjoys engaging on social media.
Rockets we ought to probably not laugh too much about because they do represent a grave threat.
Even as people try to recover from Irma, there is more hurricane trouble on the way.
Tracking 2 hurricanes in the Atlantic.
The storm is expected to strengthen as it gains.
They're a cash crop.